Live.
Oh, I'm live.
Star.
Well, it's good to be live. Good morning, everyone. So am I starting?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it is a good morning. We're finally hooked up, I hope. Anyway, this is the fifth Nobel series that we've done. I remember the first one well because I covered the economics and the peace. Fortunately, there's no literature prize, but that wasn't the economics prize and the peace prize were not so I was fortunate in recruiting David Elkins for the economics prize and the peace prize, and Belme Elkins for the literature prize. So fortunately, the last half of the Nobel series is now being done well. Well, what is there to say about David? Many of you know him anyway, but for those who don't, David's an eloquent person, knowledgeable. He certainly does his homework. And one facility he has among many is he can pick out highlights of stories well. So and that may be reflected in his background because he has a major in economics and English, the English to make his explanations of economics easier. He's a journalist by background, an editor, publisher in the medical field. And so he comes to this with a lot of skills, a writer, a poet too. But last spring was maybe a surprise for many of us because he gave a really good lecture on meditation. That was the last one of the brain series. So I think we're in for a treat this morning. So David, it's all yours.
Hello? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, here we go. So the 2021 Nobel Prize in Economics, we also say economic, is a huge deal for Canada, a huge deal. In fact, David Carr, who won it and took half the prize, is really the top economist in the States. And I can't move the slides.
Oh, they're stuck.
Okay. Sorry, we had a few glitches setting up today. So there were three winners, but we're going to talk a lot first about the Canadian. And then there was an American and someone from the Netherlands who is a Netherlander. So here is the great Canadian, David Carr, senior economic person in the States right now. He's head of the American Economic Association. And this is a very unusual picture because we see him actually receiving the news. He's on the phone with the Nobel Prize Committee, and they're advising him that he's won. So it's in the middle of the night, he's in his robe and so on. You don't see that very often. And here he is, as he normally looks, in his fully clothed and in his right mind. And it also shows how much he won. This is in Canadian dollars. So, thank you. 1,254,000. A nice big prize. He took half the prize, and believe me, as we'll find out, he deserves every single penny. Now, he is such a hero, certainly in my mind, and in most Americans' minds, that he's really similar to another hero which we had. I think you might recognize this guy. It's Chris Hadfield. And I'm just going to indulge myself here. Get him? Get the sound.
This is ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade.
stop.
So that was Chris Hatfield, and I put him in partly because I love David Bowie and I love the song, but may remember how hugely popular he was, and believe me, David Carr, by Canadian standards, deserves to be just as well known and just as respected. So he had to share the prize with two others. Well, we shouldn't say had, he shared the prize with two others, and they were integral to the whole nature of the prize. So Joshua Angrist and Guido Ibbons were the people who shared it. They each got $627,000 Canadian. I can go back and tell you a little bit more about them. Joshua grew up in Columbus, Ohio, graduated from Princeton with his PhD, and he's now at MIT, where he is the professor of economics and a highly respectable person. His contribution was more technical, along with Guido Ibbons, who is a Netherlander. He came to economics in a roundabout way, but eventually graduated from Brown, actually, with a degree, and is now at Stanford, where he's professor of economics and econometrics. So they're both highly respected people. And there's an interesting link that we'll see that they had with David Carr as they worked up their way through the ranks. Now, before we get into this, David Carr, Joshua Angrist, and Guido are labor economists. And it's important that you remember that they're labor economists because that's where their contributions are. Many economists in the past have really looked at the big picture, and you might even say that they were employer economists. They look at it from a supply point of view, and they're interested in the owners and the operators of the business. These, Banerjee, Duclos, and Kremer from 2019 were also labor economics. They were interested in the people, as were the prizes this year. And you may remember from the pitch we did and the prize we did in 2019, that their contribution was to use the medical techniques for random controlled studies to look at certain things in economics and to figure out what the best path would be. So they would have a control group and they would test it against other groups and they'd compare the results. And if you just to recall, because this is pertinent to the way that Card, Angrist, and Ibbons worked, but these were earlier on. So in this case in Africa, they used to give vaccinations by a lottery system. If your name came up, you got it. So they used that as the control group, and then they added things to it. They tried adding a mobile clinic and the vaccine. With the vaccine, the mobile clinic worked better. With just the lottery, they had 6% success. When they added the vaccine and tested against the control group, they had 18% success. And when they added a gift, a bag of lentils, they had 39%. So that was important because they had a control and they were testing these things. And they went on to test educational systems, whether things like, would it work better if you improve the textbook, or should you have more teachers or shorter classes? And it was a very successful and significant study. And it really laid the groundwork for what David Carr and his co-winners called natural economics. And what the big change was, instead of that supply and demand, excuse me, theoretical model, they really wanted to look at the real world. Now, the problem in looking at the real world is you need a control group and then somebody to compare it to. So one of David's big contributions was looking around to find an appropriate control group that he could work on to do the minimum wage. But before we get to either David Carr or Angus and Ibens, we have to look at perhaps the most tragic figure in modern economics in the US. This is Alan Kruger. If he was alive, he almost certainly would have shared the prize, probably taken the whole prize, because he worked with David Card and he worked with the other two. And he worked for Clinton as his economic advisor and very successful with Obama. He, in fact, is really the guy who engineered our way out of that recession in 2008 with Obama. So he's highly respected. He suicided, unfortunately, under somewhat mysterious circumstances. It didn't seem to be because he had an unhappy life. But, so he's in the key. He saw economic policy not as a matter of abstract theory, but as a way to make people's lives better. And that's the key for labor economists. They want to make people's lives better. So David Carr went around looking for a natural model. He wanted to test the effectiveness of raising the minimum wage against whether you would lose employment or not. So he looked around, he found, he didn't actually go to the Sopranos. You probably recognize this as a New Jersey family, but he did go to New Jersey. And so this is New Jersey in the light blue and Pennsylvania in the dark blue. And he got a break, or not a break, but he found that in, here's another view of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which I wanted to show simply because they're right up there at Lake Erie and they're very close to us. This is something we should all be able to relate to. So what he did was the so-called natural experiment using real world cases. He found that he discovered that in 1992, in January, New Jersey raised their minimum wage from $4.25, and the state right next door didn't raise them. So that meant he could look at labor in Pennsylvania, very close to on the border with New Jersey, and decide what happened with in the case where they raised the minimum wage. And the traditional view was that if you raise the minimum wage, employers will reduce staff, reduce benefits in order to cut back, and that it will be a bad thing for overall employment in the country. So here we go. He looked at fast food restaurants, which was a good place to look since they would probably be most affected by an increase in the minimum wage. And so he looked at Wendy's, better pay for better work. And conditions, of course, weren't terribly great in the fast food industry at the time. They may not be great even now, but if workers are saying they only work 12% Monday, 23% Tuesday, 25% Wednesday, 32% Thursday, and 8% Friday for a total of 100%, it's not ideal. And another thing that it's shown when you increase wages is it increases participation in employees' satisfaction with their jobs. So Burger King, Wendy's was one, Burger King was another. This might have been the attitude when they were underpaid and overworked. So you want it wrapped. And then Roy Rogers. So it was Wendy's, Burger King, Roy Rogers. And typically, would you like fries with that? Here we have three of my heroes from my youth, Dale Evans, Trigger, and Roy. So they were horsing around with the minimum wage, didn't have a whole lot to do with Trigger. I put this in because one of the things that a higher wage gives to people is more self-esteem. And during the pandemic, as we know, we heard of all kinds of problems on airlines with flight attendants and abusive passengers. It also affected the fast food industry, where people really got meaner with the servers. And one of the things that they would like them to do, particularly men to female servers, was to get them to take off their mask, which wasn't appropriate, to say the very least. So this is back to the experiment that David Carr and Kruger did. And of course, to assess these changes, you have to look over them for a while. You're not going to get them right away. And the anticipation going into this, again, going back, was that, and this was the kind of rule about economics, why you never raise the minimum wage, because employment would go down. So Card and have traced it for 5 years, and they found the dark blue line in the graph is the employment in New Jersey, and the lower one is the one in Pennsylvania. The employment in New Jersey actually went up a little bit, just not terribly significantly, but it completely quashed the idea that raising the minimum wage meant you put people out of work. So here were some of the benefits that were traced by Card and Kruger in that period and have since followed up. Because one of the things that this did was this idea of finding a natural economic, something in the real world where you could make the comparison was. Many of the other economists got very excited about it and went out to look for other similar experiments. And since then, since the early 90s when they did this, there's a vast number of studies that have been done. And so we can now see that these are the overall effects of increasing the minimum wage. It increased the economic development in low-wage areas. Very important. I mean, you would see that perhaps in Tulsa, in the black areas or places that have food deserts. By raising minimum wages, it eliminates some of those. It also reduces, because black people are paid less than white, it evens up that gap, which is a good thing. It cuts crime because people have more money in their pockets. They don't have to go up and stick up the local, dépanneur, the local Alsop. I'm sorry, the local, anyway, whatever the place is called here. It also reduces government spending on support programs like food stamps and Medicaid. You don't need as much of that if your wages are decent. And something that's generally overlooked, of course, you bump everybody's pay up, tax revenues go up. So that's the pluses and the defense for minimum wage. But it's a very political issue. And when they published their paper, Kruger and Card, it just sent out shockwaves. People were incredibly upset. This wasn't based on a model that they used to do before. This was a real world example. Look, these people in New Jersey got better paid and they had better results and nobody lost their job. So the traditional idea was, in addition to losing your job, there was a reduction in benefits. They didn't want to pay extra money, so they reduced your health benefits or increased your time off or whatever, decreased your time off. There would be less future hiring because you couldn't afford it. And older businesses couldn't afford it and would drive them out of business. And that it didn't reduce poverty. These were using the older models. None of them proved to be correct. One thing, of course, is that you raise the minimum wage relatively gradually. If you're looking at drive older companies out of business, it's not going to drive anybody out of business these days if you increase them $1 an hour, because if you're that close to the margin, you're virtually out of business anyway. But anyway, it became a huge political issue. And this is contemporary politics, Biden's proposed minimum wage hike, he wanted to raise the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage. The states also set their minimum wage, and we will be getting back to Canada. Don't worry, it's just because this is so controversial in the States these days. So he's proposed that they would raise the minimum wage from $10.50 to $15. Apologize for the comma. And it was defeated in the Senate. It was part of the original the COVID-19 package, but they had to take it out because they couldn't get it passed, and it was defeated. The good news is that he's actually put it back in for federal employees. You have to be working for the feds, and it's going to be effective next March in 2022. So the federal minimum wage will go from $10.50 to $15. So why is there fighting? Why do people fight this? It's really, to me, a bit of a mystery. I don't quite get it. There's good empirical proof that there are benefits from raising it. I don't know if you recognize this poor man, either of them, but you would recognize one of them if you saw him like this. That's Joe Manchin, the guy in the yellow shirt. So, not a view you usually see of this guy. So, in the bill that was defeated in the Senate, 8 Democrats voted against it. And these are the Democrats. Chris Coons, Delaware, that's Biden's home state. His net worth is $10 million. And we go right down the line. Maine, which we don't think is a prosperous state, 9 million, 9.5 million. West Virginia, Joe Manchin, the poor man who absolutely is against most of the labor-focused changes in the economics, is getting by on 7.62 million. And so it goes right down. Some of them are surprising. I mean, the New Hampshire has got 2 senators, Shaheen and Hassan, and they both make almost $3.5 and $4 million. They're voting against increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which is roughly $32,000 a year. And then we have our favorite, Kirsten Sinema, who no one quite understands. She's against it, but no one quite knows how. But she's famous for many things, including her clothes. And of course, 100% of Republicans oppose the minimum wage. I am clearly, I have a bias toward labor economics, partly because it's been so neglected in the past, but also I feel that those economists are more in favor of helping people than the American dream or the American way of doing things by pulling yourself up by your backs, by your bootstraps. It's not the Canadian way, but it is the American way. And if you don't do it on your own, it doesn't seem to be worth as much as it is if government gives it to you. So here are the minimum wages in the states. And this takes a little bit of caution. There's 23 states where the minimum wage is $7.25. There are 21 states where it's above $10, not bad. And California has a minimum wage right now of $13. Now we can look at the Canadian minimum wages. So here are the Canadian minimum wages. In Nunavut, we pay $16 an hour as the minimum wage. And it's all over the lot, but not below 1175 in New Brunswick. It's a little deceptive because if we go back to the other slide, the 21 states that have the minimum wage above $10 are the populous big states. So in fact, the average minimum wage in the states is lower than Canada's, but not that much lower. I just want to put that caveat because the states have stayed up. So that was David Card's initial contribution. And Joshua Engritz and Guido Ibbons, the other two, the MIT and Stanford economists, picked up on this idea of natural economics. And they saw the advantage of expanding it, but it wasn't always easy to find an easy way to change it. You didn't always have two states in which the price differential was sufficient and they could look at specific industries. So they had an empirical approach, which is what you want. And this is slightly tricky to explain, but I'll at least give you the idea of the thinking around it. So one of the things that they decided, this is a straight statement, that changes in things like government policy, wage increases, military service, and higher education should be measured by the people who normally haven't experienced it. It's a bit of a difficult concept, but you want to know what the effect was on the people that didn't get the extra, that didn't get the extra bonus. And this is Rumsfeld. Do we all remember Mr. Rumsfeld? He was a defense minister in two different regimes. And he said something that actually has some bearing on what Angrist and Imbens did. As he famously said, there are known knowns, things that we know. There are known unknowns, things that we know we don't know. And there are unknown unknowns, things that we don't know we don't know. So for economists, that presents a bit of a problem. It's how to figure out what you should do about it, to figure out how you can set up a control group and another group to figure out who's benefited from these changes, either the negative side in the draft or additional minimum wages and so on. So this slide just shows a direct relationship between years of education and income. And it doesn't show the cause for it, it just shows what happens. So if you have 12 years of education, you're at 12%. And if you go up to 16 years in wages, you get a 65% increase, which is roughly 10% a year. But it doesn't tell you why, it just tells you that's what happened. So they wanted to know why. So they decided that they would look early on at babies born in different parts of the year. And this is just a little sort of way you would have of comparing two groups who were similar but had different outcomes. So as it turns out, now this is fair, fall babies get more gravy. Well, this is based on the idea that everyone starts school at the same time in the same year. So if you were born in 1990, regardless of what month you were born in, you start school in September. And this really has to do with the dropout rate. At some point, a certain percentage of the school population will drop out. So suppose you drop out on your 17th birthday, on your very birthday. So a person who started in October of the first year, well, no, that's it. The person who started in November and quit at 17 would end up going to school for April, May, June, misses those years. It doesn't get, and doesn't get the fall. I'm not explaining this well, but the person who is born in January and quits when she's 17 gets that whole extra period of extra schooling. So there you go. That again, it's dependent on you leaving school sometime before the end. And the changes are not great. They're only, as you can see, the years of school make a small difference in the income. So the blue lines show the higher incomes for people that stayed in school a little longer. Sorry, that's a little confusing, but don't worry, it gets more complicated. So natural economics, when you don't have control, you don't have New Jersey and Pennsylvania, you want a treatment group and a control group. And our friends, our economic winners this year, set up a treatment group as people who participate and a control group that didn't participate. And they were able to show the effect using this method of education and military service individually on lifetime earnings. The more education, the more higher your income. So this is a little confusing, this particular slide, but they wanted to do trials that would allow them to compare two groups, even though the groups are quite different to some extent. So those that would sign up for a computer course, for example, some of them would have taken the course anyway, and some would be not interested. And on the other side, the people that didn't get a chance to take the course, there would some who would take a course anyway, even though they weren't offered it. And there were some that weren't interested. And they wanted to find a way to put this together. And they did, but they used quite complicated mathematical theories by looking at the people who didn't complete these experiments and applying quite complicated economic formulas. They were able to sort out a treatment group from a control group. And we'll have to take my word for it. It worked, and it was very successful. A whole raft of other economists were able to use this system to compare significant changes in government and in policy. Now we're back to a more clearly understandable natural experiment. And this was another one that David Carr did. And he looked around again for somewhere that he could compare people that had longer education with those that had less. And he was lucky, or did good research, because he found out, because in 1972, the high school leaving rate in England was raised from 15 to 16, and it didn't change in Ireland either. It didn't change in Ireland. So he was able to trace the Irish and the high school leavers who, by tracing through the years, how their income did over 5, 10, 20 years, and compare them to how the people who had the extra year did. And he found out that there were increases in income in those that had that extra year of schooling. So income, in fact, increased 10%. They were better, they were healthier, people that had the extra year. So it doesn't really take very much, just an extra year. And again, significant, because there is often a push to not increase higher education, not give people extra years in community colleges free, not encourage people to stay on in school longer. And there can be all kinds of reasons for it. But the fact is that there's definitive proof now with natural experiments that show more schooling is better than less on your income. So here's some students, here's some going back to Angren and Imbens. Here would be some keen students, the sort of group, really keen students, and the control group, students that are not really paying attention. And you look at what the results are in their lives when they graduate, follow them up 5 years and see how it goes. And of course, there's the happy few, we happy few who graduated, going to have longer, happier lives with more education. Now, David didn't stop there. He realized that there had been a major boat lift in 1980 when Castro sent 120,000 people by boat, mostly by boat, from Cuba to Miami. And there were big liners. They weren't all just, rubber rafts trying to get across the 90 miles from Cuba to Miami. So he pushed it, and there was great panic in the States, Florida, you can imagine, that if the labor force was suddenly going to go up by 120,000 people, there would be mass unemployment, the wages would, people would be forced out of their jobs, there would be people out of work, there would be a drop in wages. And as it turned out, over a 5-year period, Carr was able to show that there was virtually no drop. Well, there was no drop in size in the labor force. It went up 7% because they came in. There was no drop in wages. One of the interesting results was some of the, because that's a lot of people to dump into a small, relatively small labor force. Some of the English-speaking people, the people who already had jobs, when these Cubans came in, the Americans switched to other jobs. It had the effect of saying, good grief, I better upgrade my skills, find a better job, because these Cubans may displace me. So it actually was a benefit to the economy. David didn't stop there. Oh, well, maybe he did stop there. He did the education, he did the Cuba, and it had a huge effect on conventional economics because they were now looking at, again, and I've emphasized this several times, real life situations. And one of the results of all this was the book Freakonomics. I don't know if you remembered it. And what it had done, the work of David and the other Nobel Prize winners, Angus and Imbens, it really forced people to get out of the box and look at economics in a different way, look at it in a real world way. So these people came along, well, Stephen Levitt and Stephen Budner, and published this book. And I am now, okay. So a couple of their conclusions were this. They were trying to figure out why in the States, the crime rate had in 1990 and thereon, well, starting in the 70s. Starting in the 70s, all the economists were estimating that the crime rate in the States would go berserk, would continue to rise, would never decline, and it was a bit of a disaster, and nobody knew quite what to do with it. Of course, the things they normally did weren't very effective. They hired more police, arrested more people, and so on. But what happened, or they were planning to, what happened was the crime rate actually declined, steadily declined through the 70s, through the 80s, even through the 90s. And it's only very recently that there's been a slight blip up. So freak economics, led by Card, Angus, and Imbens, thought outside the box. And what Levitt decided in this case was that when Roe versus Wade went in, and the poorest of women were able to get abortions when they needed them, and they can trace that there were a huge number of abortions. regardless of what one thinks about abortions, it did effectively reduce the number of children these poorest of women, the people at the bottom of the society, had. And it was those children, for better or worse, that ended up becoming criminals. They were able to do the research to show that. So abortion reduced the number, it improved the lives of the women, let's say, or it didn't make single mothers struggle with kids who ended up being criminals. They also did a number of other experiments, and they're all quite amusing, Freakonomics by the name. Another one, for example, was they found that there was a similarity between sumo wrestlers and Chicago teachers. This is the fun part of economics. How can there be any similarity between sumo wrestlers and Chicago teachers? Well, when you actually get down to look at it, you find that both of them are prone to incentives, or another word for incentives is bribes. Sumo wrestlers were notorious for fixing their fights if they were paid extra. In the case of Chicago teachers, they found that if their students' scores didn't do well, their salaries were reduced and they risked losing their job. So the incentive was to raise students' scores unjustifiably, and they did it. So that's sumo wrestlers and Chicago teachers, both a little iffy. The other thing that Freakonomics did, and I'm not going to get into this, but they decided through a number of looking at a number of people that Bill may have something to say about this, but that they looked a little bit at the nurture and nature debate, and they found that children, it's not too surprising, but children who came from better homes that were happier, had more money, got along better, did better in life. And that was more important than trying to tutor your kid or take them to classes, encourage them to go for music, do all of those things. They were not as effective as it was if you came from, let's say, a good family. So that was one of the finds. And this woman to me looks as though she must have been a great mother. And it means she didn't have to tutor her kids and push them around and take them to classes and all of that. They probably did pretty well on their own. And of course, there are all kinds of examples, but you wonder about, say, someone like this. Was Einstein's parents, did they coddle him along and give him extra lessons and all of that? Or was he simply a naturally born talent that probably, I don't know, but probably had a relatively good upbringing? So that's it. Thank you very much. This was a little bit short, I expect. But if you have any questions, send them by email, or I can answer them now if that's happening. Oops, I can't. That's okay. Oh, I can.
Does anyone have any questions?
David, can you hear
Yes.
me? Yes,
Yeah.
hi. Just wondering, with the push for quarterly earnings to always go up, there is a great strain on even businesses that already have, they're always pushing the margins. You were saying that, businesses that can't survive when the minimum wage goes up because their margins are already precarious. But there is this incentive in the supply side of economics to push the margins anyway, so that they can always show an increase every quarter. And I wondered if there was any discussion around that, that is a counterproductive push in the economy that squeezes things so that everything becomes more precarious than it has to be.
Well, absolutely. And that's a huge economic problem. And one that we simply haven't. Growth is a problem. Can you have endless growth? Why do we have a problem with the climate? A lot of it has to do with endless growth, with buying new clothes from China or whatever. The economy, we don't have in the West a good way of dealing with it. There have been a lot of people who tried to deal with it, but we're so geared to the idea of growth. And the whole Western economic thinking has always been key to growth. There should be a solution, but there really isn't. I mean, in the case of companies that are driven out of business by minimum wage rights, they probably deserve to go.
Right, but has it always been the case that it was so driven by quarterly earnings? I was thinking in the 70s that there was a shift, but I'm just not familiar enough with it. That has it always been so focused on that? I mean, yes, on growth, but on quarterly earnings?
This is a very big subject. The stock market right now has gone berserk. You cannot possibly understand, if you had looked at the stock market in 1970, I can't remember exactly what it was, but let's say the Dow Jones was 800, not 35,000. May have been a little higher than that, but not a whole lot. The reason that economists, or certainly labor economists, think that it's that high is that government has been favorable to business. They've done it, particularly during Trump. There were all kinds of reasons. They cut taxes, which was part of it, but they cut regulations. They made it easier for businesses to make money. And the emphasis when you're driving a market is going to be on quarterly earnings. The more often you can get that little tap up, the more interest investors will have in buying stock. I don't think it's a healthy thing. We got the 1% out of this idea too, which we didn't talk about. And there is going to be a comeuppance at a certain point. This really, I'm not saying it's a bubble, but it cannot simply go on forever and ever. That with the danger of climate change and so many different things changing, and quite right, it started to change in my view in the 70s. But 1970 to me was a key word, a key year. And but that, just talking about the 70s, I just had been reading a review of that. This is a happier note. Two things. About the Beatles. Paul, what do you think Paul's net worth is these days? $1.2 billion. So that's the sort of sad part. The happy note is that I understand the new 50-hour tape that they've brought out showing the last makings of the last movie will be the ultimate final on the Beatles thing. And I hear it's absolutely delightful. There you go. Thank you very much.